Today I want to run through some quick slides on one of the, I, I don't know that I'd exactly call this a moral theory, but it is a type of way of thinking about ethics, and that's moral relativism. Okay, I won't cover that first part because we did that at the end of the last lecture when we talked about personal identity. That was the landscape of different ethical theories, but the slide will pop up again. Then I want to talk about Nietzsche, who is not a relativist. I need to make that clear. But he is an important thinker, and there's no other place really to stick him in. So we'll talk a bit about some key ideas of his, and then we'll move on to relativism and a particular kind of relativism called cultural relativism. Okay, this is all stuff that I talked about on the last lecture. You can, it's online, so you can go ahead and look at that if you need to do some review. So we'll jump right into Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. He lived the latter half of the 19th century. A very, very important thinker. I think he was a person who really set the tone for a lot of modern thought. And if there's any line of Nietzsche's that people know, it's this phrase that God is dead. Well, what does it mean? The first thing I want to say is that although Nietzsche is certainly an atheist, this is not intended to be taken literally. God is not the kind of thing that can die literally. God's a necessary being, so either God has always existed or never has. But so Nietzsche can't mean that God once existed and then does not now because he literally died. What I think he means is that well, here's an easy way to say it. It's probably wrong, but that there is no privileged perspective. Ultimately, what he means is that there's no such thing as transcendent meaning and value. And when I say no privileged perspective, Nietzsche is what we call a perspectivalist about truth, right? So I can't say everyone sees the world from a particular point of view, from a particular perspective. And if God exists, then God's perspective is the way that things are. Okay, but if there is no God, then there is no perspective that is the right perspective. So that seems to imply a kind of relativism. Although Nietzsche is certainly not going to be a full-blown relativism because there are some things that are true from every perspective. Some values that mainly life, that one should value. Okay, this is not nihilism. It's not the rejection of all truth. Okay, but what he does say is that there is no transcendent meaning and value. There's no meaning or value that transcends the world. There is nothing that is thrust upon us from outside, that is. Okay, now one way that Nietzsche tries to prove this is called genealogy. He's got a work called On the Genealogy of Morals. And what he tries to do in that book is to uncover the roots or the development, the ancestry of ideas, our moral ideas. And his goal is to show that those concepts that we think are absolutely true are not absolutely, nor objectively true. They're simply just products of contingent history. And had history been different, then those ideas would have been different. So he thinks this shows that what we think are absolutely unchanging and eternal truths are really just accidentally true. I'm pausing here to see what's on the next slide. No, I should tell a story. Here's the basic story that he tells about the development of Christianity. Christianity developed in the context of a culture that was dominated by another culture. So the Jews dominated by Rome. Jews had no power. Rome had all the power. Well, everybody Nietzsche thinks, has something that he calls the will to power. And you can think of this as just this fundamental desire that we have to thrive and flourish, survive in the world. Well, how can somebody have that, or have that will to power, that desire for power, but if they don't have any actual power, how can they exercise that desire for power? Everybody wants to survive, thrive, and flourish, but not everybody naturally has power. There are strong people and weak people. Now, this is going to be the difference between two kinds of morality, according to Nietzsche. One is called master morality. Master morality has two basic concepts, the good and the bad. The good is what is noble and powerful and aristocratic. What he has in mind here are like the heroes of the Homeric poems. Now, good is opposed to bad. Bad is base, weak, and powerless. The good here is the ability to thrive, flourish, survive in the world. Okay, but there are these other people, the people who do not have power. And they hold something called slave morality. First of all, they're dominated by a kind of psychological attitude called ressentiment. It looks like resentment. What he has in mind here is a kind of hatred of one group for another. The powerless despise the powerful. And what happens, on his view, is that the slaves then, the powerless then, invent this new moral framework that takes that good-bad distinction and turns it upside down. The good then becomes the evil and the bad becomes the good. Now, if you can get the other side to accept that, then that's a way of seizing power when you don't naturally have it. So both parties here are expressions of the will to power, which is, one can think of that as the fundamental instinct in life. It's a drive to control and dominate. Now, a person who can do this is something that people talk about a lot with Nietzsche. It's not at all clear that this is an important concept in Nietzsche's philosophy, but it's an interesting thing to think about. So there is this concept called the Overman, Übermensch, sometimes the Superman. And that person is the person that recognizes that values are made for oneself, not forced upon you or found. And a test, apparently, for determining whether or not you're close to being the Overman is the test of eternal recurrence. Can you imagine living every event in life in an eternal cycle? So that everything that happens to you in your life will happen again and again and again as you live this entire life again and again and again. How do you respond? If that strikes into your heart a sense of terror, then you're not the Overman. The Overman is the person who can think of this and approach this possibility with a sense of joy. Because that means that the world is not the thing that's given to you, the world is something that you create. Okay, that's a short little bit about Nietzsche. If you want to know more, I teach a senior level course in existentialism. A third of that is on Nietzsche. So really, really fun course. And it's, I think there's some really important ideas there because Nietzsche is one of the main modern critics of Christianity. So Christians need to understand Nietzschean thought. Some of his criticisms, I think, are not well-founded, but others are good criticisms of at least Christianity as it was practiced during his day. So we need to understand which ones are bad criticisms so that we can respond, and which ones are good so that we can change the way that we practice our faith to avoid these sometimes very good criticisms that he makes. Okay, relativism. Relativism in general, a few things about that. The definition of relativism is that truth in some domain is not true without qualification, but only relative to facts in some other domain. Okay, so that means in order to for something to be relative, there has to be something else that it's relative to. And the thing that it's not relative to is that's something that is itself not relative. Okay? It only makes sense to say that something is relative if there is something else that's not relative. That means there can't be a coherent global relativism. For example, here, it makes no sense for someone to say all truth is relative. Because you'd have to say, the next question to ask would be relative to what? And then that what, whatever the answer is to that question, there have to be truths about that are not relative. Okay, so not all truth can be relative. But there are truths that are in fact relative. For example, which flavor of ice cream is best is relative to our sense of taste. Okay, one person has a preference for one kind of ice cream, the other person has a preference for another kind of ice cream. So which is best? That's relative to individual taste. Okay, moral relativism is the claim that moral facts are relative. Well, again, they have to be relative to something else, so what would they be relative to? The most common proposal is that they're relative to the beliefs of cultures. Okay, so moral facts. Cultural relativism is the view that moral facts are relative to the beliefs of cultures. Now, here is the most common argument for cultural relativism. So let's look at this argument and then we're going to evaluate it. Premise 1, different societies have different moral codes. No objective standard to judge codes, that's premise 2. Premise 3, our code has no special status. 4, so there's no universal truth in ethics. 5, the moral code of a society determines what's right in that society. Therefore, we should adopt an attitude of tolerance. So I want you to notice a couple of things about this argument. First of all, premise 4, that there's no universal truth in ethics, that is supposed to follow from 1, 2, and 3. So 4 is really a sub-conclusion here. Given that different societies have different moral codes, there's no objective standard to judge them, and ours sort of has no special status, then it follows, the argument claims, is that there's no universal truth in ethics. And if that's the case, the moral code of society determines what's right. Therefore, this is the goal. Okay, the other thing that I want you to notice here is that this is the real motivation or the goal for this argument. The motivation is to get us to be tolerant towards each other. So the claim here is that given that there is no universal truth in ethics, we should adopt an attitude of tolerance. Okay, so is this argument good? Well, it's going to turn out that no, it's not. But let's see about premise 1. What's the case for premise 1? Well, here's a story that comes from ancient Greek history. And it's a story about the Greeks and the Galatians and the Persians. So the Persians were the largest empire. Darius, the Persian emperor, notices that as the empire becomes bigger and bigger, it encounters cultures that it were unfamiliar with. And one of those was, as it pushed west, the Greeks. Another was the Galatians. He noticed that they had different practices and what looked like different moral practices. The Greeks, when a family member died, they buried the body. The Galatians, instead of burying the body, they cannibalized the body. They ate the body. Okay, so he called both groups in and asked them separately how much money would it take them to get them to change their practice to what the other group does. Well, of course, you can imagine that the Greeks were horrified and said, no, we'd never do that. But it turned out the Galatians had exactly the same response. They were shocked and horrified and claimed that they couldn't possibly do that. Why? Because it wasn't a way of respecting. It didn't show respect in their minds toward their dead ancestors. Okay, so the claim here is that different societies have different moral codes. Let's before we go criticize the argument particularly, let's think about some consequences of moral relativism. If moral relativism is true, we can't say that the customs of other societies are inferior to ours. Now, the cultural relativist, who is saying that we should adopt an attitude of tolerance, when stated this way, the cultural relativist won't say that that's bad. But we have to remember, if cultural relativism is true, we should tolerate different moral beliefs in societies, no matter what they are. So that could also mean we should tolerate other societies when they are engage in maybe human sacrifice, or they subject women to systems of domination or something like that, or commit genocidal acts against another group, right? So surely these are cases where we can say that the customs of those societies are inferior to ours. Another consequence of cultural relativism is that we would decide whether actions are right just by consulting our own standards. It's the moral beliefs of our culture that make our actions either right or wrong. But that also would mean that we could never be wrong about anything, okay? Surely an action is not right simply because this is what we do. We have to have reasons for believing that action is right. Another consequence is that there's no such thing as moral progress, or for that matter, moral regress. Things do not get morally better or morally worse. They just change. The beliefs change. There's change, but there's no progress or regress. Okay, so let's go back to the argument. Let's think about it. First of all, it's an invalid argument. Here's the reason. Okay, well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that premise 1, 2, and 3 don't entail 4. Remember, 4 is supposed to follow for 1, 2, and 3. The fact that different societies have different moral codes does not mean that there's no universal truth in ethics, that there's no fact of the matter. For example, let's imagine that you're in a math class. You work a problem, your professor works the same problem, and she gets a different answer than you do. Well, are you going to go to your professor and say, we have a disagreement, therefore there's no right or wrong here, there just is difference? No. If there is disagreement, that either means that there is no fact of the matter and everybody's right, or somebody's wrong. Okay, so disagreement itself doesn't entail that relativism is true. Now, but there's also reason to think that premise 1 is not as true as we think it is. So premise 1, again, being the premise that different societies have different moral codes. It turns out that there is much more moral agreement across culture than there is moral difference, I think. For example, if a culture is going to survive, there has to be a belief in that we should care for our children, okay? Because if a culture doesn't believe that it should care for its children, it's not going to survive past 2 generations. If there has to be a belief that murder is wrong, at least it's wrong to kill people within the culture. Again, if there just is random killing within the culture, then it's not going to survive. There also seems to be a need, although this gets a little tricky in a couple of cases, there seems to be a need that we think that lying to each other is wrong. So a presumption of truth. Because if we can't trust the other people within the culture, then we have no reason to cooperate within the culture, and then the culture breaks down. So it seems to me that there's a common moral core that you can find when you look at other cultures, regardless of what their religion is, and regardless of what sort of environment they live in. Okay, another problem, I should have said this when I was talking about it, is invalid. That claim that there's no universal truth in ethics is absolutely inconsistent with the claim that we should adopt an attitude of tolerance. So the problem here is that cultural relativism is the belief in cultural relativism is absolutely inconsistent with the motivation for being a cultural relativist. Right? The motivation is that you want people to be to be tolerant towards other cultures who are different from ours. But if it's true that there's no universal truth in ethics, then no sentence that includes should will be objectively true. Okay, so you can't say there is no universal truth in ethics and also say that I should do anything in particular. Okay, so you can't claim that there are no objective moral truths and assert something as if it were an objective moral truth. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not something that we can learn from relativism. First, we shouldn't assume that everything that we believe is based on an objective standard. Sometimes what we think our moral truths are may just be, it could just easily be that we're wrong about those things. So what I'm thinking about are our beliefs about slavery in the 19th century, for instance. So this reflected a belief in the culture, but it's simply wrong. Okay, so that means we should at least approach these differences with an open mind, and always be willing to examine our own beliefs. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we should give them up if there are differences, but that does mean we should seriously ask the question, why do we believe that this action is right and this action is wrong? And if it turns out that that's baseless, then maybe we should change. But it may very well turn out to be the case that we have good reason for our moral beliefs. But that process of examining them is something that we should be willing to go through. Okay, that's it for relativism. I'll see you in class next week.